So our guest speaker tonight is Brad Cloepfil, founding principal of Allied Works. Mr. Cloepfil founded Allied Works in Portland, Oregon in 1994 and has then spent the past 26 years working with clients to develop projects that encompass both client needs and vision, as well as the specificity of place. In June of this year, he authored an essay called Invitation, the Architecture of Equity, which will be the topic of tonight's lecture. And rather than continue to describe that lecture, I'm going to let Brad take it from here.
Thank you guys for showing up, and thanks for the invitation, especially the nature of the invitation response to that short essay that we wrote in early summer. And that was in response to the whole chaos of George Floyd and the necessity, I think, just to weigh in. And architecture is a difficult profession in this conversation in many ways. It's a fascinating conversation, I think, that we can have around it, both relative to the work and then relative to the nature of office culture. And we'll talk about a little bit of the office culture in the end. But it was interesting when we sort of decided collectively that I should write something. It was hard in the beginning, and then I just started thinking about how we approach the work and the intention behind the work, and then it just began to kind of flow. So I'll walk you through some of the work and some of the ideas. I really want this to be a discussion. So at the end, I hope some of you will chime in. There's a lot of language in this talk, but I think it's important because the language really inspires the work. And if you guys could take a minute to read this quote this piece of a poem that I stumbled into. Rilke is always a go-to for some things. But the nature of architecture as amplifier, as something that makes things more themselves, more understood, more clear than they could be without architecture. So it makes activities, relationships, cities and landscapes. It has the ability, and it doesn't always do this. In fact, I would say it rarely does this, but it has the ability to bring things into acute focus. And that's a tremendous inspiration of our work and everything we do. And the nature of how we approach the diversity of projects we have, the diversity of architectural language, if you know our projects. A lot of it is cultural, most of it's public, there's some workspace. But every project we take as a very specific new beginning with no assumption of formal language, no assumption of materiality, and really try to determine, what the building is serving. And I'll talk about service in a minute. But this idea of what kind of invitation does the building extend? And I kind of came into this language maybe a year ago, this idea of invitation. And I think it came through talking to Lars Mueller once about what a book offers, the kind of sense of grace of a book, right? That there's an exchange, and the book has a responsibility to kind of invite you in. And that really struck me. And buildings obviously even, well, I don't know about even more so, but equally or more so. So this notion of thinking from the very beginning, what is the invitation you're extending? And all of this, I will say to you guys who are students, this goes counter to, formal language of architecture, counter to theory of architecture. It's really about looking deep into a situation, a city, an institution, and asking yourself what's possible, and thinking about how invitations get extended. We do this in a more specific way with each project. Looking at the Grand Palais in Paris. For some reason, the headings have all gone away. It's probably because I was in charge of putting this together. So That was a mistake. But the Grand Palais and the Black Lives Matter in the street, these notions of just either co-opting a building for a different use, co-opting a street for a different use, and suddenly it becomes a public forum in whatever way, and it gets embodied in public activity. And art, is probably one of the most dominant and predominant ways of co-opting space, repurposing space, bringing attention, meaning those sort of acts of public art, and this one seemingly guerrilla, but commissioned in DC and Union Station. All of these things are a way of extending invitation, and the invitation can be manifold, right? It can be an invitation to stop and examine something closer. It can be an invitation to re-examine your relationships with something. It can be an invitation to reconsider some of your assumptions about public space, private space, politics, as far as Black Lives Matter goes. And then how do buildings do that? This is a really long conversation that we could talk more in studio someday about that. But how do buildings extend an invitation? And that we're going to get into all different qualities of that. But transparency is one of them. We'll talk about formal language. Blurring boundaries is another one. Co-opting space again. The National Portrait Gallery. Claiming space that becomes public that wasn't before. Elevating, setting aside. There's all these words of part of, I think, invitation is distinguishing it. And this is something you could debate and we could talk about, but is distinguishing it from the day to day, right? When things blur together as one thing, we tend to just sort of follow our familiar paths. But when we encounter something that's exceptional in some way, right, that interrupts our assumed, our assumptions about things, then it becomes a conversation. And I think buildings are uniquely good at that. This is a project we finished a year ago or two, the Providence Park soccer stadium in Portland, about 3 blocks from my office, which was really fun. But we brought the stadium right to the street, and in that way engage the city in the life of game day, even if you're not in the stadium, even if you're not coming. And we built over the street, which I'll show you in a minute. We built over the street, so as you walk down the sidewalk, you're actually in the stadium. So blurring that boundaries of public, private, extending the energy of the stadium out, so you don't feel like you're kept away from it because you can't pay admission. There's some kind of exchange in that isn't required that you enter into that building. And that idea of a public exchange, I think, is also a really important thing to consider. And all of these things may sound philosophical, or too poetic perhaps, but to me and to us at Allied Works, this is how we begin designing. These are the conversations we begin with. What is the nature of the events that take place? What's the character of a city or a building as a site? And in this really was my first project, Wieden & Kennedy headquarters. We took this building, a full block building, and created a void in the middle. And in that void, 350 people come together. And as we were building this auditorium for this advertising agency, I sat with the founder of the agency, Dan Wieden, and I said, Dan, this space is bigger than you guys. We have to do something with this. And it became a public space in a private building. The symphonies played in there, all kinds of events and activities. It's actually one of the most civic spaces in the city of Portland, and yet it is private. But so it's the intent of the design, or when you recognize that the design transcends its original purpose and takes on greater meaning and greater opportunity. It also takes a kind of intent by the owners or the people who occupy the building to allow that kind of interpretation. But the space inspired it. It wasn't, that wasn't the intent in the beginning. the intended was for it to be a private space, and it became a public space just by its nature. We kind of discovered it as it was done. Pacific Northwest College of Arts is another project in a abandoned customs or a post office building and customs building. And we moved an art school into it. And just that juxtaposition between the historic facade, and we'll get to iconography in a minute, but ways of occupying and repurposing buildings, I think, could be one of the greatest acts of invitation, because the building has a kind of ambiguous life, ambiguous iconography. I think that invites, in this case, it invites experimentation and exploration as an art school. I mean, it was a kind of perfect way of reoccupying this abandoned historic building. A couple projects specifically thinking of that, and this one, they're pretty charged. There's some really interesting things we've been allowed to do in the last few years. This was the competition for the National Veterans Memorial Museum that opened 2 or 3 years ago. Not that, man, I can't tell, I have no sense of time anymore. I don't know about you guys. It could have been last fall, but I can't really remember. I think it was a couple of years ago. But it was a new institution, an invented institution by the city of Columbus and the state of Ohio. Didn't exist, and on a site that was really vacant. So I conceived of the building as a landscape space. And that was before we really understood what would go on underneath it even. That it was a piece of earth lifted out of the park that had what I called a processional and a sanctuary. So we made this public space as the primary identity and form giver of the building, as a place of reflection and a place of celebration and ceremony and all of the different activities associated with service. And it became also then a museum to service. And as you'll see inside the building, but it's a sanctuary, it's a kind of sanctified ground, if you will, held by this structure, these enormous cantilevered concrete arches that I can't believe we actually got built. And then it tells a story of the kind of lives and of the veterans in various occupations in various ways, and really talks about service. And it was an incredibly moving project. So, finding the language of a building, this is the Clyfford Still Museum, what you're communicating to the people who visit, getting people in the door of cultural buildings is getting more and more challenging. We'll talk about that later on. But once you're inside the Still Museum, it's really a place of exploration where you explore archives and closed storage, walk across bridges between galleries, and just kind of blur the boundaries between presentation and exploration and storage, and make it a place that you feel free to kind of wander and find your own space in. And in the end, it's all about the art, but there's these small outdoor courtyards, which have benches in them since that picture was taken, where you can stop and linger too. I mean, my goal in designing the Clyfford Still Museum, it's next to the Daniel Libeskind Denver Art Museum and a couple other cultural buildings that are very robust in their iconography. And this place, I wanted it to be, in contrast, a place of silence and introspection, so that you could come and eat your lunch sitting in that little private courtyard, smuggle your sandwich into the museum and just find ways to occupy the museum, even if you just walk through the galleries. So it was a kind of destination that way, in contrast to the bombastic language of these other cultural monuments. So these are just ideas, thoughts that came up when I was preparing the lecture. Some of them, inspired by the essay and implied in the essay. But these are the things I think that we are both our opportunities and our challenges as architects when thinking of how we extend these invitations and the barriers that we either subconsciously or consciously put up for people's participation and interaction And these choices are really incredibly important. And we could question some of the choices we've made at Allied Works. I mean, I have you'll see as I walk through this that I have a bias towards topic number 5, wonder, where I guess early on in my career in traveling, I would wander into spaces that were so awe-inspiring that I was just intrigued and filled with that kind of curiosity by the possibilities of this architecture and discovering what was in it. And so that's been a driving force of our work at Allied Works, I think, from the very beginning. But iconography, service, applied narrative, which is a really challenging one, catalyst and wonder. And well, these are, again, just meant to be points of conversation more than anything else. But building imagery is a hugely important conversation, important subject. It's interesting. In the beginning of Allied Works, we would design the outside of the building and find the expression of the exterior of the building at the very end of a project. It was never our intent. It was always our intent, and it still is. Although we've learned, and I'll talk about that a little bit. You know, it still is about the experience and what the experience communicates for both the nature of the institution and the city and the community, and how it engages people around whatever the subject is and the conversation of the building is. But what the building communicates to the world and how it communicates, you know, there's been both a bias, I think there's an ongoing bias both for and against neoclassicism still being employed today on many, many, many college campuses, which is always shocking to me. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But then, you know, what's the responsibility of contemporary architecture to communicate its intention, right? Is it just communicating the ideas of the architect? And that's good enough. And since we know it's new, there's novelty to it, we are intrigued by it, and we come to it to explore. You know, I don't know if that was, I mean, I'm sure that was true in Mises' day, by contrast. So where you fall in this conversation of tradition, you know, the language, really considering what it's communicating, you know, and that the perceived communication of that exterior building is important. It is critically important. You know, just, I mean, the kind of the Western world, the iconography of churches and chapels, you know, the iconography never ends, right? To the bronze panels on the doorways, all the way into the paintings, the murals, the language of the vaults and arches. I have terrible internet connection here. So in Allied Works, you know, there's a range of expression of our buildings, but they are all abstract. You know, they're not associative, they're not narrative, right? They are intentional. Some of them, whether it's a sanctuary of Clyfford Still that's more private and something you discover, or the transparency of the University of Michigan, or the robust form of some of these projects because of what they're representing, a monument and a memorial to the nation's veterans. These choices are critical. And I think thinking about what you're communicating and how you're communicating that to the world is absolutely critical. How one engages the building, how one enters the building. Do you feel invited to a building? I mean, it's, you know, when you're doing, you know, when you're designing cultural buildings, by nature, they are somewhat set apart, right? They're not community centers. They may be programmed as such, and, you know, how the building gets used is something else altogether we'll talk about. But it's a very interesting thing, whether or not people feel comfortable coming to a building that is unfamiliar to them, both in form and in language, and how they feel comfortable or not. And it has a tremendous amount to do with our culture and the education that people are getting about ideas and art and exploration or not. in our culture right now, we would say primarily not. A lot of public schools don't even have art programs anymore. So it's an interesting time in that way. The National Music Center began with a concept. Well, it was inspired by the limestone hoodoos, these limestone formations that actually Clyfford Still painted as he grew up in northern North Dakota, which I didn't even know at the time that I was doing this. But also then the building was conceived as a series of 5-story instruments that could be played by both the museum and the guests. So whether those instruments were auditoriums or exhibition or workshop spaces or recording studios, all of which were in the program. It was a sense, the building was intended to be a series of these kind of landscape icons that had a specific life of music inside of them. And this was the concept model that we took to the first interview, which, if you haven't heard the story, was interesting. We were trying to figure out how to communicate the basic idea, the kind of distilled idea of the building. And I was frustrated. They were far too architectural and formal or far too abstract. The client, wouldn't be able to understand. So I actually made this bombastic statement: can't we just go find a musical instrument and cut it up and do something with it? And the earnest young architecture interns went to Goodwill, found a trombone, went down in the shop and came up with one of those pieces. And I was just completely blown away, because it was everything we were aspiring to. Everything we were aspiring to in this building was manifested in this model. And resulted into a series, same thing. Those forms ended up morphing and touching structurally in this way to suspend the bridge across the road. There's some transfer beams, by the way, they're touching inside. But this building, again, we talked a great deal. It's the National Music Center of Canada. That it needed to have form, it needed to have a memory, it had to have a sort of formal memory to it, so that it could occupy the nation's memory and become a place that sort of takes its place in a national conversation of architecture. In contrast to the Clyfford Still, which you'll see, which was never even intended to be seen as a facade. So we talked about it a great deal when we were designing the building, how you enter the building between these enormous kind of structural landscape moves. Contemporary architecture always seems to struggle with front doors. I don't know. It's always a struggle of ours. I guess that's one of the good things about colonnades and pediments. You really get a kind of clear language. And then inside, the building is a mystery. It's a kind of series of bridges between these various musical experiences with light pouring down, and then the structure and acoustic surfaces weaving together. The building was really intended also, as far as invitation. There's a 350-seat auditorium that opens up to the entire building. And I had recently seen David Byrne's installation in New York, where he was playing a building with an organ. He had it wired to the pipes and cast iron elements of the building. And so I thought it'd be great if the musicians that played in this performance hall could play the building. And so all the interstitial spaces that you just saw in the previous slide, music moves from that auditorium all the way through the building. So as you go from these separate activities, you're engaged in that life. I mean, a music kind of without source even. And we work with acoustic engineers. All those surfaces, the tiles are gapped for absorption and reflection. But really allow the building to be literally an instrument to be played. And as I said, Clyfford Still being kind of the opposite. It's really an intimate museum of the work of one artist. So it's really about you as an individual and your experience with his work. And this is one of the first sketches I did, which showed the building kind of rambling around without a boundary. And then I found out we had really strict property lines that I had to abide by. But the important part of the sketch is the building is embedded in a grove of trees. And that's how I conceived it. I conceived of a building that you really couldn't, once the trees were mature, it would have no facade and you would just encounter it under the canopy of trees. And that's the sort of, that's the way the experience was conceived these are the idealized 40-year-old trees or 30-year-old trees, which we'll see how that happens, because these are the trees you can afford when you start to build a building. But those choices very distinct, that you would just sort of come on, you'd have your lunch under that canopy of trees, you'd see the entrance, sort of move into it and up to the building. And then the invitation extended with the new US Embassy in Mozambique, in Maputo, which is just finishing construction, on an amazing site on the Indian Ocean. And this was in the previous administration, where the conversations we had were really about transparency. And even though these buildings have such strict security controls now, to really make them feel open and inviting to the world. That is obviously very different administration, but that was our intent. So it's really a glass building with what were originally conceived as structural screens that block out all of the direct sunlight during working hours. Each facade has a different pattern of aperture based on the sun angles. But you can see into the life of the building. You're kind of invited into the building. We've set all of the security walls in these landscape ha-has. So we tried to make it so you didn't even see any security walls, because most embassies are really these walled kind of bunker compounds. But we took on the challenge of that security that the building relies on for the 450 people that work there, and tried to communicate an ethic about our nation, and how we consider people from other nations, and extend a sense of welcome. The building itself, and this is really important, each zone in these buildings have different security clearances. But once anyone can, well, there's a security gate outside, that's the first. But once you do that, you can enter into the lobby and see all the way through the building into the areas that you can't actually necessarily occupy. So you see the entire life of the embassy, and people working and people having lunch and eating and walking from their desk to different places. So the life of it, and you can actually see it clear from outside. So just different ways of thinking about what a building communicates, how it invites you in, what language it uses of contemporary architecture in our context. And then there's this idea of service, which I talk about a lot in the office. What is the building serving? Which really has to do with insight. I feel that this is a tremendous responsibility of architecture. Is if you're building a building that's 20, 30, 40, 180, $200 million and more, tremendous amount of time and resources and energy put in by a building community, a community raising the money. It's a lifetime experience for a lot of people, whether it's donors or construction workers or curators or whoever. And so this idea that the building needs to serve something more than itself, right? And provide some level of insight, right? And to do that, for people to experience that possibility of insight or investigation, they have to feel safe. They have to feel, like there's a sense of accommodation. And this is a really tricky one, because a lot of contemporary thought wants to challenge people, right? That's sort of our responsibility as contemporary artists and architects, right? Is to challenge people's assumption, and whether you have to do that with radically novel form or not, and how one does that, I think is really part of the interesting possibilities of the investigations we look into at the office. But if people don't feel welcome, they don't feel safe. I mean, one of the things I talk about in the art museums is our role in the art museum is to really invite you into a place where you just sort of release all of your assumptions of what you know and open yourself up to new ideas. And that should happen in schools, that should happen in music halls, that should happen in workplaces, that should pretty much happen anywhere. So, but that moment of exchange where someone feels invited and safe, feels like they're being spoken to in some way, right? That's somewhat familiar, but then also challenged to think. It's that people will shut down. We as human beings, when we don't feel safe, if we don't feel respected, if we don't feel taken care of to a certain extent, we will just close down, and any exchange of ideas and conversation will end immediately. So how do you inspire that sense of openness? And again, it's the nature of the invitation and the iconography, somewhat more welcoming, even with the kind of heroic Roman language of architecture at the Met on the left, and then somewhat terrifying in its vacancy and lack of scale on the right. And so I think scale has a tremendous amount to do with it. I mean, many public spaces are monumental by nature because they're accommodating great numbers of people. But how does one begin to make that building work for both 500 people and one person? And that's extremely difficult. Extremely difficult. This is speaking of safety, this is really where I learned that lesson more than any other building. A long time ago, we won a competition for the Booker T. Washington Magnet Arts School in Dallas. Open public high school, anyone auditions for it. It's one of the most magical places I've ever been. These kids are just incredible. And it was the first Black high school in Dallas, segregated high school. But so we had both to kind of elevate and amplify that history. There was a wonderful group of alumni we got to work with in this project. And they were incredibly excited about the evolution. They were the ones who are most open to the language of the contemporary architecture, interestingly enough. They wanted the building to be reinterpreted and kind of reinvigorated and re-inspired, and the legacy to go on. There was many people, because the original building was historic, who resisted the language of contemporary architecture attached to that building. So a lot of different constituents in this project, as in all public projects, but a very exciting project. And this combination of old and new in down, that's the performance hall on the right. And it ended up making this courtyard kind of cloister, if you will, for performances, for hanging out at lunchtime, a kind of safe place for the kids in the city that they could interpret and use. And they have impromptu music concerts, performances during lunch, everything they can. And then inside, it was really interesting. It's a series of open, 3-story open courtyards. So whether you're in dance or art or literature, even you exchange with other artists when you're going between classrooms, and you can yell down and cross bridges and everything else. And then places in the hallways where, like, that's a class on the lower left, where impromptu music things can happen. There's a lot of, we broke all the rules for schools and like doubled the amount of undedicated public space, corridor space, so that the students could find ways to use it that weren't programmed. And that issue, which will come up in some of these art spaces too, that idea that you create a space that's really an instrument to be played, right? Or a platform for investigation, that you give up control, right? It's the opposite of Peter Zumthor's beautiful building at Bregenz, his beautiful museum that, at least when he opened it, he wanted curatorial control of any art being shown in it, right? He wanted it to be one vision, and which the building is gorgeous, so it apparently worked, and the art looks fantastic. But with our buildings and our architecture, again, whether it's a public school or a museum, for me, it's just something you're setting in motion. But the architecture is the first step, and the real joy of it is to see how it's used, and how the use changes, and how it's surprising, and how it evolves. And then on a different, entirely different take on service is Cloepfil Still Museum, where we were building a building in service of one artist and his work. So we knew what was going on in there. We knew the art. We hung the art in a half-scale model, half-inch to the foot model, way before the building was drawn. We were really serving these particular proportions and scale relationships, and then a relationship with your body. The kind of crafting and intimacy between Clifford Still's work and you as you engage the building. So very, very particular. Not the open instrument at all, but something very, very particular that you really engage with. Once you walk through the threshold, you're in this world of Clifford Still, and you're sort of giving yourself up to it. And then again, back to the timbers with this way of broadcasting. It's a church of a sort, frankly, in our contemporary culture. Probably every sports, that's probably the most vital religions to a lot of people in cities around the world today, are your local team. But it was amazing to build a building. We just did this addition, and we built a building that brought 4,500 people into a relationship in a stadium that occupies 25,000 people. I've never opened a building with 25,000 people before. It was kind of an amazing thing. I mean, it really allowed me to see us as the architects, what architecture does. It brings people together. It really is an incredible, incredible, incredible thing. Yeah. So, and then in small and intimate ways, and this gets into iconography a little bit too. Material choices have a lot to do with it. People feel welcome in wood buildings in a lot of areas of our country because it's a local building material that they're familiar with. It's on the scale of residential buildings. This is a kids arts camp, an urban kids arts camp, where they come out into the woods in Oregon for art education programs throughout the year. And how one extends that and the hearth is a huge part of this enormous fireplace at the end of the building, kind of to make it more domestic and more inviting to people to use. And they have all kinds of performances and lectures, but entirely different intent than a lot of the other things that we've done. This one's tricky, especially in today's world. Population versus community. There's how one communicates community and how much one abides what is popular, right? As far as iconography, as far as use. I won't talk about this a ton, but I felt a responsibility when you talk about iconography and the language of architecture and what it's communicating. There's a history, Casa de Fascio by Turani. We all know that, I forget the city outside of Rome that the fascists built. We won't even talk about Berlin and the co-opting of history, but architecture is used that way, and sometimes by intent, sometimes not. This on the right, Trump's rally at Mount Rushmore, co-opting that massive landscape sculpture for political purposes. And then in more quiet and maybe subversive ways, at least from my point of view, Thomas Jefferson's University of Virginia, and then Robert Stern's co-opting of historical language to sort of assume cultural legitimacy, right? Co-opting of a historic style, to project a sense of cultural legitimacy. And that's on university campuses all over this country in particular. That is probably the most common language of architecture. Is a kind of, you can't even call it neoclassicism anymore. I don't even know. Co-opted neoclassicism, I guess. But it happens in contemporary buildings too, and I couldn't find the right photos in time. But I think, to be fair too, there's a lot of buildings that are novel for novelty's sake, right? Thinking that, you know, it's a kind of consumer mentality of architecture, that if we make it novel, like the stair project at Hudson Yards, Heatherwick's stair project, the Stairway to Nowhere, right? A kind of pandering to the public with novelty. There's all kinds of different conversations one can have that, but I think just being aware of the choice of what and how you're communicating, both in the language of the architecture, but it's all about intent, and intention matters. Intention matters, and if you serve that intent, if you're careful with that intent, it'll communicate through the development of the design. And then what buildings set in motion? I talked about that a little bit earlier. Just quickly, I'll use the University of Michigan Art Museum. It's the only contemporary building on the historic part of campus. We actually restored the historic building and then built this contemporary addition. It's the existing building was set up on a piano nobile. This building's right on the street. This building has 3 different entrances where students can enter. There's no sense of, you know, going through a ceremonial front door. It's completely accessible at all times. Students can walk through it without paying admission and look up through an atrium and see the art. So there's ways. Yeah, there's a path, a winter path that goes to the University of Michigan because the weather's so bad. And this hooks up to an indoor winter path that students can go through. So they're kind of, you know, asked or invited into the museum without having to pay or go through security or any of the other things. But the way they use the museum is fantastic. This is a piece, and I really apologize that the labels dropped off. I did that in like the last 15 minutes somehow before the talk. But this is an artist that wrapped the building, an African artist, I believe, that wrapped the building in burlap, which I just love. I wish it was permanent. And then the ground floor gallery there, that's their kind of temporary experimental gallery that you see the neon in at the bottom, and then the glass floor on the right. Oops, I dropped off. I dropped off again. Anyway, just the idea that these buildings, even in the kind of quietness, in this case, of the limestone language that we had to use because of Central Campus, you know, the way the building is used, the way the license you're allowing it to, that you're extending to the people who occupy the building, right? To really mess with it, interpret it, you know, change the use, project on it, you know, do dances in the galleries. Yeah. I mean, all of those things. I mean, for me, I would hope that any building that we design inspires people to use it in new ways. That's really the responsibility, I think, of the architecture. And I think if the spaces are beautiful, if they work, if they're inspiring, people will find a way. And this is just for contrast. This is not criticism so much, but this is the Pulitzer Foundation of Art on the left by Tadao Ando. Set back from the street, closed off, cloistered, extremely beautiful building. And we built next to it, the Contemporary Art Museum, St. Louis, a non-collecting museum that we put right on the street corner. The building actually cantilevers over the sidewalk. And the window on the right allows you to see in from basically the stoplight all the way through the galleries to the courtyard. So very, very different intent, even though museums are all cloistered to a certain extent because they have walls for art to hang on. You know, we made those simple gestures to try to blur the boundaries between the street and the art. And then again, very, very simple building, series of concrete walls and plaster walls with natural light and apertures. And then since it is non-collecting, it's used in endless different ways. It really is just a platform for any kind of installation or activity. And it's simple. This building is our least expensive art building. And it is the one that more artists comment to us how inspired they are to install things in the space than anything else we've done. And it's just an open framework of 2 concrete walls that weave over the top of each other, you know, below and over the top. That's it. I think this building literally was $225 a square foot. It's really kind of a fascinating. So we sort of set a life, and there's that transparency to the intersection. We kind of set a life in motion between art and the city. And it's been really, really exciting to watch how it gets used. And kind of wrapping up, this idea then that goes really to the core of it, that it's the experience of the building that, even though iconography, invitation, all of those things, I think we are drawn to buildings that have powerful experiences or uncommon experiences, things that we don't encounter in our day to day. And you can also argue that those experiences make people feel uncomfortable, and put some people off too. So, I mean, that's the delicate balance, I think, that we've been talking about throughout this lecture. But the idea of evoking people to think, to be inspired, evoking artists to do amazing installations, right? Things you've never seen before. Evoking a sense of wonder. This is looking up. This is standing in the middle of the lobby of the National Music Center of Canada, looking up, where all of this structure touches and diverges, and all the walkways, and the light comes down. And that's the space the music goes up into that leaves the open auditorium. So, encountering things you haven't seen before. Anne Hamilton's piece on the right, I forget the church on the left. But again, intention is everything. And so using this language, this language is for me is not applied. These are not post-building analytics or explanations. We use language as inspiration. I mean, that's why I started with a poem. When we try to talk about the quality of a building, the experience of a building, we explore it with language as much as we explore it visually with diagrams and concept models. And so that language you use for describing your building, the language you use that inspire your building, but it has to be perceived too. I think that's the other thing. It has to be something people can engage. It can't be a private narrative of postmodern culture, as deconstructivism is so notably did. If you were a student of postmodern literary criticism, come on in. You'll understand my building and you'll be able to engage it. But I think buildings have a greater responsibility than to themselves and their own theoretical premise. Although sometimes as beautiful artistic models, of course, it's very powerful. So anyway, I think, there was one thing I was going to mention just at the end. This is in the auditorium in the National Music Center, looking out across the lobby to the walkways across the lobby where people are pausing to hear the music being performed and kind of enveloping the entire experience of the building. So just something about original intent and about Allied Works too. The office was named Allied Works for a reason, to try to bring people together, to bring ideas together, to create a collective and extend an invitation that way to young architects to come and work with me. I made the determined choice not to call it Brad Cloepfil Architects for that reason, chose the word Allied in hopes it's aspirational, and it works most of the time. But that takes effort too, and to bring people of different backgrounds and genders and racial backgrounds into the office takes real work. Architecture is a very exclusive profession for reasons that I've never understood. We have tremendous issues of equity in architecture, so it takes ongoing diligence and effort at every single level to extend that invitation. And I just thought it important to mention that on the day-to-day as well. So thank you for sitting through yet another Zoom conversation, especially at night. My gosh, you poor guys. But I'd love to answer any questions or hear some of your thoughts, anything at all.
Thank you very much, Brad. That was fantastic, and kind of exceeded just even what I had initially asked for this lecture. So thank you very much. We do have some questions. The first one is Kira Byrne.
Hello, thank you so much for a brilliant and very thought-provoking presentation. I guess my question is kind of broadly, with so many of the public buildings you design in public spaces, how do you work with the needs or wants of the client, with the needs of the public, and what you know as a professional architect? How do you kind of combine all those together to create a design while still being able to make progress? Because I know with so many people on board with the project, I'm sure it can be difficult to kind of make quick progress and come to conclusions. But I was wondering kind of how you approach that with the need of the user and then creating an experience that's inspiring in a way.
It's really interesting, and it is, the process is inspiring. You know, I mean, sometimes there's a tremendous amount of public input, and sometimes very, very little, right? It depends on the community too, right? That you're working in. I mean, with the Clyfford Still Museum, for instance, we barely even worked with the board. It was the director, one person, and us. Well, and then Clyfford Still's two daughters that were involved in the trust. But it was, you know, it was really about serving that work, and it was up to us. You know, the idea of creating that grove of trees in front was my ideas. I actually asked to get that land from the city so that we could create that place of refuge for people. So there's that there's that experience. And then there's, you know, most museums, all of the public hearings. University of Michigan, we had a town and gown meeting where the community said that it's a really beautiful building if you would build it on North Campus, not in the historic heart of campus, right? They didn't want contemporary architecture, right? And, you know, the museum itself talks about the programming and how important it is to bring new ideas in architecture to a university, because universities are all about new ideas. And it was an amazing conversation, actually, back and forth. And I have found, even with the kind of transformation of the building on Columbus Circle for the Museum of Arts and Design, I had people stop me on the street for the first 5 years afterwards saying, I was dead against that building and now I love it. And so there's this, and to me, that's tremendous success, because we showed something that people were afraid of, they had never seen before. They were changed, right? We know this about politics. Human nature doesn't appear to like change very much, and are threatened by new ideas and new people. Tremendous amount of our kind of human nature seems to be trending that way. I think we all have it to a certain extent. There's a little bit of resistance of the new. So when you propose the new, you know, you listen, you talk about ideas, you talk about scale, what you're inviting, the kind of life of the building, right? I mean, transparency has everything to do with it. Letting people see the activity and life of a building is, I think, is probably one of the most important. So, you know, having the activities of buildings spill out into landscape, blurring the boundaries of building and landscape. But it's a conversation. It's a real conversation. And the best clients are the ones who really bridge those forces of boards and community and artists and activity. I mean, a really great visionary client, I mean, that's how you make the best architecture, because they're the guides through all of this. But it's fascinating. It is really, really, really fascinating.
Our next question is from Catherine Wood.
Hi, thank you so much. This was such a cool lecture. I came in a little late, but just like the energy in the photos that you showed us is so captivating. Like I just got thrown right into it. You talked about how like intent is everything. How do you identify when you've kind of lost your way in the intent? Like when you lose focus and things get too cluttered or busy, how do you figure out when to stop and like reevaluate?
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's a fantastic question. Yeah, intention. So finding that sense of purpose and intention is always hard. And it's, the research you do, the listening you do, the visual exploration you do, the language you use. And for us, and as you just pointed out, that's the greatest challenge of architecture, because architecture, especially civic architecture, takes 4 years, 6 years, 8 years sometimes, and goes through all kinds of brutal forces of, resistance, community process, budget process, construction conventions. It's a enormously public art, right? So it's under siege. It is. And so we use those sketches and concept models. I don't know if you looked at our website. We use those concept models, and we step back and kind of reconcept. Even at the detail level, when we're in construction drawings, you kind of step back, because if you follow the details to a dead end, you realize something's wrong. If the idea of how one details the building isn't working, you're doing something wrong. It's you that's the problem usually, right? So stepping back, kind of reaffirming what the intent is, how this particular scale of the architecture or area of the architecture, material focus, is serving the greater idea. You continually have to step back and reassess, and then use different tools. Like, that's what's so critical. We could talk about this forever. It's like another lecture. Using the right medium to investigate the ideas, right? Like, sharp pencils are not, unless you're really, really good, are not for exploring kind of fundamental concepts. You can do it, but I've rarely seen people do that. What tools you use to pursue what ideas, right? There's tools you use in construction drawings, there's tools you use in design development, there's tools you use in schematic design. And they're all driven too by what the material language of the building is too. You use different tools for exploration. We've made ceramic models. The National Music Center, we did porcelain concept models to try to think of these rings of structure. I don't know if you've seen those. So I think being diligent of when to step back, when to shift material investigation, when to ask questions, right? It's really interesting when, obviously we are fundamentally a service profession. We're providing, spaces that people need and want and use, and questioning their assumptions is huge. Questioning people's assumptions about how they want to use the space, how they think they're going to use it, how big it needs to be. It's a constant, for us, a constant process of questioning, investigating, reassessing, which is why we just don't make very much money at Allied Works. But yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that.
I actually have the next question, and I just wanted to reiterate for those that maybe came late. If you do have questions, go ahead and put an X in the chat box, and I will call on you. My question, though, is that, as young architects and as young architecture students in schools, we are, imbued with all of these great philosophical ideas and these ethical stances, and that's wonderful. And then we get into the workforce, and some of those are kind of intentionally crushed by our bosses, or they just end up kind of not quite working out. Do you have any advice for those students that are really trying to push some of these different morals as they get into the professional world?
Yeah, it's kind of goes with everything we just talked about. Architecture embodies, I think once I told students at the University of Arizona, 5 different disciplines or 5 different professions, and I can't remember what they all are. But, most of them most of architecture profession is a commercial endeavor. It's to make money. right? I never went into architecture with that intent. I wish I had a little more than I did. But but you can't ask, it's what we were just talking about with I think Catherine, right? You can't ask a question that someone's not intending to engage. You work for a big corporate firm, you don't try to make art. That's not what they're about, right? And you don't probably do buildings that sacrifice time or budget, or that's not what their intent is. So I think there are people who do strictly social practices. There are people like Allied Works that do civic and cultural practice and think of architecture as an applied art. There's all different kinds of collaborative practices between disciplines now. I mean, it's an exciting time in architecture because there are so many different modes of practice, right? But unfortunately, I think the primary, percentage of the practice is just commercial architecture firms. And that's very restricted. I mean, you still get to work on buildings. Sometimes they're beautiful, right? But it's a very narrow conversation typically, some more than others. But I think that's why I think when you get out of school and, depending on your own economic resilience, right? Making those choices, right, can change your career forever. Like if someone's worked for a big corporate firm for 10 years, it's very hard for them to come to work for us because we have such an utterly different way of thinking, approaching, detailing, the materials we use, the way we think about things. Our process is totally foreign to them. So it's not one homogeneous, it's not like we're all just doing buildings. It's very distinct. So I think the more you think about it, and the more carefully you're able to choose. Again, I went to work for SOM right out of school because I needed money and they offered me a job. I was a terrible employee because I really didn't enjoy it very much. It didn't align with my personal, goals. So, but I learned a lot. There is that too. So.
Thank you. Our next question is from Michael Kim.
Hi, Mr. Cloepfil. I'm a huge fan. So I spent a lot of time this quarter investigating community architecture that is grounded in the local. Mm-hmm. And there's so many striking buildings that are like, formally striking that I see like, in like design articles, magazines, and in school. And Allied Works has a long history in civic architecture. So my question is, what's your approach to grounding your design to site, and what sorts of ways do you reach out to the community?
Yeah, see, I wish I had more examples. Next time I'm going to give this talk again and I'm going to keep working on it. Grounded in the local, and there are really beautiful, small projects basically all over the world right now that are intensely grounded in local construction techniques. And there's such beautiful examples and small things. I mean, we found ourselves dealing with kind of major civic buildings that have a kind of both a responsibility and a liability, I guess, in some ways too, of expressing permanence and cultural stability, and a lot of those age-old and maybe somewhat archaic ideas about what cultural institutions are. So, I mean, I think the conversation that's breaking down to more incidental. I wanted to get photos. The artist in Chicago that started a whole series of civic buildings and cultural centers. Anybody know his name? You should look it up. And I'm embarrassed. I can't think of his name. Oh, anyway, there's a lot of very exciting things happening right now, but they have a very different intent than what we have been tasked to do. So again, it kind of goes into that conversation. It'd be really fun to do some of those things, but we haven't as yet. So our responsibility is to just think about larger issues of landscape and city and the kind of context that we're building in, like St. Louis, building right to the street. When we built in St. Louis, all the blocks around us, other than Ondos, were non-existent. There was no real sidewalk building. It was just devastated. So we chose to establish a street corner in a city that essentially didn't have them anymore. So I think for us, it's just an examination of site as much as anything else, really, really beginning with an idea of thinking about the nature of the urban or rural landscape. But you kind of asked two questions there. And I think the first one is really, really interesting. And I think some of the most exciting things are happening in small ways, certainly in the last 10 or 15 years. I think some of the most subversive, interesting things are happening in small ways, right? But I also think it's interesting. This is a somewhat provocative idea, though. A lot of times I'll see small things that are just kind of miniature versions of larger formal architecture discussions, rather than truly things that can be other. Right? When you kind of give up that responsibility of making something look like a design piece of architecture. I think there could be a lot more evocative exploration of smaller things. Things that don't, I mean, when you build a building that costs $140 million, there's a responsibility that building lasts, for me, for 100 years anyway, right? And so when you're building something more provisional and more responsive, and maybe, some of the smaller things you're talking about, I think you could explore more of those ideas, because that institution maybe isn't trying to occupy that building for 100 years, right? It's something more proactive and progressive, and it'd be exciting. I'd love to do that. Actually, I haven't really told anybody in my office this. We're about to embark on a series of propositional projects that I'm calling cultural catalysts. The things that you insert into communities to evoke different cultural responses. And it would get to some of these things. And it has to do with careful thinking and analytics of both place and community, and inserting those catalytic acts of architecture to whether it's, to provoke conversation or protest or healing or art or performance or any of those different things, but things that are more provisional like that. Yeah. So we'll see what happens.
I look forward to seeing those.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for coming and speaking with us. It was just a fantastic lecture, and we really, really appreciate your insight. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks for the questions. Those were fantastic.